Okay, good morning and welcome to the webinar. It's great to see so many people signed in. I think the last time we looked, we had something like 400 to going on 500 people. That was the last time I looked because that started to terrify me, but thank you for engaging anyway. And I hope you find this both useful and relevant to you. So let me start by introducing myself and Freya, and then I'm going to say a few things about the webinar, and then we'll move into the metacognition and the planning framework. So I'm John Eaton, I'm Director of Kingsbridge Research School based at Kingsbridge Community College. And Freya Morrissey is our evidence lead in metacognition, so our expert in metacognition. She's based at Teen School, where she's also head of English. So the way this is going to work is I'm going to do the talk to camera bit because I felt that if I tried to do that and engage in the chat box and try and answer questions, I will get hopelessly derailed. So thankfully Freya has agreed to answer your questions. So we've got her carefully ensconced in the chat box, which you should see to the right of your screen. We are keeping her watered, but she will need feeding with questions. And it's also worth saying, if we've got anybody joining us from the EEF or from the Research School Network, if I could ask you to introduce yourself in the chat box, I think that would be really helpful. Obviously, Kingsbridge Research School can support a lot of the schools who've tuned in today, whatever the terminology is. But if you're in a different area, then obviously you might need to get in touch with a different research school. Before we start, just a quick thank you to Teaching Schools Southwest and particularly Martin Smith for helping set up the webinar, and to Alison King for dealing with the admin and the registration emails. You'll also hear from us after the webinar because we will upload this once it's finished, save it as a video, so you'll be able to access it if people arrive late or if there are parts of it you need to review. So this morning's webinar really focuses around this question: how can we adjust our practice to help students learn remotely? And you'll notice what I've done there is use the word adjust rather than change, and that's because what I'm not advocating is any kind of wholesale scrapping of what we already do, but actually an adjustment to some of our practice. Many of the things we do in the classroom we can transfer to an online environment, but I would imagine, like me, you found places where that is a lot more challenging. So trying to do, for example, a group discussion is not a simple matter when it's online. And throughout the webinar, what I'm going to do is really put forward an argument for a shift in emphasis rather than total change. And in essence, my argument goes something like this. So we know that metacognition is a high impact strategy, especially for our disadvantaged students. We know it can be taught, and this is where the framework will help. When we're in the classroom, I think we as teachers often shoulder a lot of that metacognitive load because we are on hand to help with things like planning and monitoring. But when students are learning remotely, they don't have us on hand to support them in the same way. So we really need to shift the emphasis from teaching subject content to teaching subject content and subject strategy, by which I mean things like the metacognitive knowledge and regulation that will help our students become more independent learners. So hopefully that gives you a bit of context for the webinar, and as I said, the aim really is to answer that question: how might we adjust our practice? So let me talk you through the agenda. So we're going to start by thinking, where does the advice actually come from in the first place? What exactly do we mean by metacognitive strategies? I'm aware that a lot of you watching will have been on research school courses, or you'll have looked at the metacognition guidance report. But in case some people watching haven't, I think it's really useful if we're all on the same page. We're going to look at why metacognitive strategies are especially important now, what exactly is the EEF's planning framework, what it looks like in practice, and then at the end what I'll do is give you a few tips around implementation as well. Now, although I'm the one talking to camera, the content of the webinar is really based heavily on the hard work of the EEF, and in particular their rapid evidence review. And if you haven't seen that already, I would really urge you to go to their website. There's a tab there that says COVID-19, and you'll find inside it all sorts of resources to support schools and parents as well. So let's move on to metacognitive strategies. Now, if I type the word metacognition into Google, the first result I get back is a Wikipedia entry which defines metacognition like this: cognition about cognition, thinking about thinking, knowing about knowing, and being aware of one's awareness. And although they're not inaccurate, they're very much closed loops in terms of definitions. They kind of answer the question, but they certainly don't tell us how to act or how we might go about being or teaching metacognitive skills. So it's a bit like saying, if you want to practice playing the guitar, you want to get better at playing the guitar, then practice playing the guitar. Okay, what should I practice? Practice getting better, and so on. And we kind of go around in circles. So it's true, but it doesn't tell me what to practice or how I might do that. So instead, the EEF conceive of this using this particular diagram. And you can see there that it's not just about planning and monitoring, which is an assumption people often make. So here it's split into two main groups. You've got metacognitive knowledge at the top, because metacognition also rests on cognition. We need knowledge of things like a task, a strategy. We need self-knowledge as well. And at the bottom there, we've got metacognitive regulation. So our planning, monitoring, and evaluation. So if I return to that guitar metaphor I mentioned and use that to illustrate these different parts of the diagram. So let's say I play the guitar, and although I can more or less strum my way through a song, I really struggle when I get to a faster passage that requires a bit more kind of intricate fretwork. So as an effective learner, I have knowledge of my strengths and limitations, and I recognise that one limitation is playing fast. I'm not particularly accurate when I try to play fast. So if you have a look at the metacognitive knowledge box, that is my knowledge of self I've been talking about. And we shift over to knowledge of task. I can set myself a very specific task, okay? Improve my speed and dexterity when playing those more complicated guitar parts. So in the middle, we have knowledge of strategies. So I had a look at YouTube for these to see what I could find, and I found something called the spider walk exercise. And essentially the way this works is, if you imagine, you can try this at home, if this is your guitar, these are your strings, you're putting 4 fingers on a string, and we are walking one finger across at a time, and while they're doing that, the other ones are remaining perfectly still. Okay, so that is a spider walk exercise, and if we can practice that very slowly, we can use a metronome and get faster and faster and faster, and that is a strategy that will specifically improve my dexterity. So the point is, I'm being proactive about all of this. I'm aware of a limitation. That awareness has made me set a goal, and it's also made me find a particular strategy. I've not just floundered around practicing aimlessly. So let's look at the bottom row, metacognitive regulation. So my knowledge of self also tells me that if I plan to practice for, let's say, 5 hours every day, by hour 3, my guitar is probably going to be flung from the window, and in fact probably shortly followed by myself. So I need to make a plan that is a lot more reasonable. And what I decide to do is to practice the exercise for, say, 5 minutes every day for 1 month. And I can help myself monitor that by having a calendar, and maybe I tick off those practice sessions. That keeps me motivated. And to evaluate, maybe what I do is record myself at the beginning and end of each week, so that I have a continual sense of whether I'm improving or not. So let me just sum that up with a definition that I've taken from the Metacognition and Self-Regulated Learning Guidance Report. And it says, these learners are proactive in their efforts to learn because they're aware of their strengths and limitations, and because they're guided by personally set goals and task-related strategies, such as using an arithmetic addition strategy to check the accuracy of solutions to subtraction problems. These learners monitor their behaviour in terms of their goals and self-reflect on their increasing effectiveness. This enhances their self-satisfaction and motivation to continue to improve their methods of learning. And I wanted to read that because it sums up the steps in the diagram there. But I like the emphasis at the end on self-satisfaction and motivation as well. One of the benefits of helping students to become metacognitive is that they acquire a real sense of motivation from that. So let me just stop there and reflect. And what I'm going to do is pick out a couple of points that I think are really, really important about metacognition. So the first of those is that our most effective learners self-regulate and organise their approach to learning. We know metacognition is a high impact approach to improving the attainment of our least effective learners. So what I'm saying is, if those are the things our most effective learners do naturally, then we can make the assumption that our least effective learners perhaps struggle with that. So we can make a real difference to them by helping them acquire those skills. The good news is it can be taught. And another really key point, which I haven't mentioned so far, is that this is especially powerful when it's subject specific. So we're not talking about kind of generic thinking skills that are divorced from any particular subject. And again, if you go back to the spider walk exercise I mentioned, that is a really guitar specific exercise, or at least string instrument. I'm not just saying practice a repeated pattern of notes. I'm saying here's a strategy that will improve your dexterity specifically on the guitar. Okay, so let's think, why is all that especially important now? And I'm kind of going back to what I said at the beginning as well here. That I think when we're in the classroom, we can look around the classroom and we can see the student who is struggling. Because of our subject knowledge, we have maybe the perfect example that will help that student. We can support somebody else with scaffolding, and I can quickly get a sense even that perhaps I need to pause the lesson, reteach a certain aspect before carrying on. And obviously when we're not in the classroom with our students, that is a lot more difficult. So just to return to that argument I made at the beginning, I would also say that I think one thing that often happens in the classroom is that we naturally take on board as the teacher some of that responsibility for metacognition. So we might take on the responsibility for supporting students with a plan or helping them to monitor and evaluate. Hopefully we don't do that all the time, because if we're saying this is a motivating thing, we really want to shift that responsibility onto our students. But the point is, all of that is even more important now when we're not there to support all the time. And that brings us to the EEF's Home Learning Planning Framework, which is designed to do exactly that. So if you look at the chat box, there should be, or there will be, a handout tab there. And if you click on that, you'll be able to download a copy of the planning framework. We'll also add the slides from this session there as well. You don't necessarily need that now, but if it's something you want to refer to later, then that is where you'll find it. Okay, so the first thing to say is this is not, don't think of it as a lesson plan, okay? These are the steps in what might be a more extended learning sequence. So this could be more than one lesson. So what we'll do, we'll have a look at the framework first, and then we'll have a look at a few examples in a moment. So the first step of this is labelled Activate. And essentially this is a simple prompt that's going to connect them to prior learning. So we did that right at the beginning. I had a question there about how we might adjust our practice. And the aim of that was to get you into a frame of mind where you're thinking about how we teach remotely, although I'm sure you're in that frame of mind pretty much all the time. So why do we do that? Well, we do it because if we access relevant information in long-term memory, essentially that helps us acquire new information. It helps it fit into our existing schemas. And for that reason, we're more likely to remember it. And it's the reason why TV shows often start with a previously on Game of Thrones, because there'll be things in previous episodes that perhaps we've forgotten, the little details we've forgotten. And if we're reminded of those, then it helps us assimilate the next episode, so we can appreciate the full magnitude of whatever terrible thing Joffrey is about to do. So again, that's the sort of thing a more effective learner will do. And I keep saying this, but I think it's worth repeating. Since a lot of them don't, we need to supply the prompts and point out that's what we're doing. Obviously, we can do this through simple reminders. We could provide relevant vocabulary. We could use brief quizzes. We could use a video link, or it could just be a simple prompt. Last lesson we did these things here. So let's have a look at step 2. This is the explain phase. So remember, the way to think of this is we are explicitly teaching strategies alongside content, not just subject content. So if I make a pre-recorded video demonstrating how to do the spider walk exercise on a guitar, I am explicitly teaching you a strategy, and you can take that away, and that is a strategy you can then use yourself. And what I should do is explain why that strategy is helpful and demonstrate it as well. So in the classroom, obviously we could do that using something like a visualizer or the whiteboard, but we can do the same through carefully written instructions, or better still, live or pre-recorded video. Maybe an analogy for that is something like a YouTube cooking channel, where we don't just get the ingredients and the dish, we often get the presenter talking out loud as they're making the dish. And in that situation as well, that is a very specific dish that's being made. It's not it's not general advice, it's strategy that supports the construction of that particular dish. Okay, so remember, our metacognitive strategies are always more effective when they are linked to particular subject-specific content. Okay, now on this slide you'll see a question which is solve 3x minus 2 equals 7 for x. And if I'm a student and I don't understand that question, then I'm going to remain pretty much stuck. So one other thing that really, really helps with explanations is worked examples. So if you compare what's on the screen at the moment with this, where on the left you have a worked example, here what we're doing is providing a scaffold that's really going to help the student make sense of the explanation. Okay, so let me just put myself in the role of the student there. And what I would do is look at the worked example. I can see it says solve 2x minus 3 equals 1 for x. It tells me to add 3 to both sides. So obviously what I'm trying to do here is remove the 3 from that equation and to simplify it. So if I have a minus 3, I need to add a 3. Effectively, that gets rid of the 3. But to keep it balanced, I also need to add the 3 to the other side to make 4. Right, now I'm left with 2x equals 4. What I need to do is to get rid of the 2 so I can find out what x is. So how do I do that? Well, I divide both sides by 2 and I'm left with the value of x. So as a student, I've had a look at that worked example. I can now have a look at the question I'm being set. And in the same way, I can see that, okay, the first thing I need to do is get rid of that minus 2. So how do I do that? I add a 2. I need to do that to the other side and so on. And I'd work my way through that. So having a worked example alongside a question there is going to be really, really valuable. So we've looked at 2 of those steps. We've looked at the activate phase, where we put the strategy in context by linking it to prior knowledge. And we've also looked at the explain phase as well, where we explicitly teach and demonstrate that strategy. So let's move on to the practice part. So I think this is something we don't often give enough time to in the classroom, let alone via remote learning. And very often we teach a strategy without giving sufficient time for that strategy to be actually embedded. And if you think back to your, when you learn to drive, your official driving lessons, were they in themselves sufficient for you to become an expert driver? The answer is probably not. Probably it required a lot more practice than that initial support. And it's certainly the case with subject strategy as well. So you saw in the explain section a moment ago a worked example of a maths problem. I think the other thing we need to remember in the practice phase is that scaffolding is, when we put up scaffolding, we don't intend to leave it there. It's something we plan to remove gradually over time. And that's the same with worked examples. So it's great to use them, but we also need to plan to gradually fade those worked examples so that we are left with independent students, not dependent students. So we can use sentence prompts. Knowledge organisers can support this. We could use model answers. Whatever we do, though, we try to remove that support gradually so that students, the skill is passed on to the student instead of remaining in the hands of the teacher. Okay, so then we look at the reflect stage. So the most effective learners use tasks they've completed to evaluate their progress, and often that is an implicit process. So we did this a little bit earlier. After the first two steps, I kind of paused, I had a reflection, picked out some key points. We did it with the metacognition section as well, excuse me. So how do we do this? Well, it could be a quiz on whatever platform you're using. We're using Show My Homework, and we can set multiple choice quizzes that way, so we can use that to generate reflection. It could be a RAG rating sheet. It could be a What Went Well, EBI. It could just be a simple prompt that asks them to reflect on how things have gone. The other thing to say about this part of the learning sequence is it doesn't necessarily need to come at the end. We could do this multiple times. We could do this in multiple parts during a learning sequence. So finally, we come to the review section. Now, as I said, if we want to store something in long-term memory, we tend to rehearse it like an actor learning their lines. We probably review the material in multiple ways. We link it to things we already know to help consolidate it. Now, if I were going to blank this slide out and ask you in a few seconds to recall what was on it, you'd probably find that really easy, and that's because you've just seen it. It's right there. It's excuse me, it's right to hand. But importantly, that does not help you remember it. If, on the other hand, I'm going to ask you to do the same thing in maybe 2 or 3 days, that is going to take a bit more effort to recall, and that effort in itself is what is helping you to learn the information, to help to embed that memory. So trying to retrieve information, especially just after you start forgetting it, is what helps us retain information. Okay, and it's also why just going over notes isn't that helpful, because you look at your notes, because they look familiar, you think, I remember that, I knew that. But the chances are you probably don't, and what's happening is you're just getting a sense of false confidence. Whereas if it's an effort to remember something, it's in the back of your mind, you're struggling to recall it, congratulations, that means you're probably learning it. So how do we do that remotely? Again, quizzes are a very obvious way to do a review. But we can do things like use mind maps as well, or simple kind of brain dump of everything they remember about a topic. That could be partially scaffolded for them, so there may be headings, but there are multiple ways of doing that. And I would say there are lots of blogs on the Research School Network looking at memory and retrieval, so I really encourage you to go and look at those if that's something you want to focus on. So that's the framework. Let's look at how this affects our teaching practice when we teach remotely. So to me, what this does is shift the emphasis from content to strategy, or even better, content with strategy. So this is how I've been thinking of it. If you look at the screen here, we've got in the classroom subject content. The green bar there is probably the highest thing on my agenda. Okay, and that balance might be wrong, and I think that's one of the things this situation is making me reflect on. Is the balance, is the usual balance correct, or should I be focused more on strategy? So subject content is, let's say, maximized. Alongside that, we've got subject strategy, so the actual skills of, depending on the lesson, maybe it's a skill of annotation. If I'm looking at a poem, for example, is slightly reduced. And if the version I've got on screen there, if you look at the yellow bar, let's say that represents student effort, and the blue bar represents teacher effort. So what that is showing is that the teacher can do a lot of the in-the-moment work to support the acquisition of effective strategies. Okay, I can provide prompts at the moment I see a student struggle. I can pause a lesson, I can reteach a thing, I can set individual targets, I can glance around the room to get an overview of progress. So in other words, I can take on a lot of that responsibility. Now, if we think about that remotely, I would argue the content, or what I'm realizing is I need to probably reduce the content somewhat and increase the strategy. Okay, and since the onus will be on the students, I need to do a really good job of equipping them with the right tools. And that is exactly what the EEF's framework is helping me to do. So it's giving me a simple way to focus on increasing the focus on subject strategy. And it gives me a reminder that strategy is a thing to focus on. It's not just a lesson plan. It's specifically about trying to embed metacognitive skills. So, for example, I might shift from something like this, where I've got poem 1, poem 2, poem 3, poem 4, poem 5, to something like this. And what I've done here is scale back some of the content and put way more focus on practice and the acquisition of metacognitive skills. So let's have a look at a really simple, just to fit it on the slide essentially, lesson plan as another example. So I mentioned a poem, so let's say we're teaching a poem. And the aim is to get familiar with the poem and what it's about. So to do this, we read the poem, we have a guided discussion, and we talk about which images seem particularly important, what this word connotes, what this line might mean. Following that, we have a guided following that, we have some teacher-led annotation, so that we all understand the same points and we're all kind of on the same page. And then we follow up with a quiz, either in that lesson or in a subsequent lesson. If we think about this in terms of the framework, we end up with more emphasis on metacognition and strategy. Of course, hopefully we get that in the classroom as well, but as I said, I think it's especially important that we emphasize that now. So here you can see the activate part gets us to reflect on the strategies we've used before. So we're trying to put them in that mind frame where they're thinking, how do you deal with the poem? What have we done in the past with the poem? We may have lost some of the whole class discussion, but a video actually gives us an opportunity to really focus on modelling good annotation. Maybe in the classroom I would just annotate. Maybe I wouldn't spend enough time saying what is good annotation. So now I've actually got an opportunity to make that the focus. We might reflect on that as a core part of the lesson sequence, and that is useful because it's a transferable skill. They can use that with other poems. We might put more emphasis on scaffolded practice, so the skill is really embedded. And again, we'd want to review that knowledge as well. So finally, what I want to do is end with some advice about implementing the framework. Because it's probably okay to watch this webinar and think, yeah, that's good, I'll do that. But obviously, if it doesn't change practice, then it is a waste of time. So as a research school, we're always really keen to stress ways to implement evidence-based approaches. And if we're saying this can make a big difference to our disadvantaged learners in particular, then obviously it's something we really need to try to do. So here's what I'd recommend. Firstly, just reread the framework. and have a look over the slides I've used today. Since we planned the webinar, the EF have released exemplars as well. So remember, you can go onto their website and find subject-based examples of the planning framework. The second thing is to keep it manageable. So I would recommend focusing on one group or perhaps even one lesson to start with, rather than trying to do metacognition with everybody at once. I think just focus on one group or one lesson. The third thing there is to have a goal. So try to break down exactly what it is you're trying to do. So as an example, let's say I want to focus on the activate phase, just that one bit of the framework. I'm just going to get good at that. My goal might be, okay, so I'm going to start each lesson with the last lesson we did this statement. We're going to make a short video that recaps the key points from the previous lesson. If I want to focus on the explain phase, maybe what I will do is make a pre-recorded video in which I carefully model how to do a particular calculation. So the next thing we want to do is identify the essential features of your practice. So if we go right back to the beginning and mention the spider walk exercise for the guitar, remember the active ingredients for that, the essential features were that 4 fingers go on one string, we move one at a time, we don't move the others while we're doing that. Whether I do that exercise in the morning or at night, that doesn't matter. So that is not a critical part of that exercise. So you can see the issue. If I can specify exactly what the exercise looks like, then I can communicate that to other people. And if I can't specify what it looks like, it becomes really difficult to do that. So let's have a look at an example. My goal is I'm going to make a pre-recorded video in which I model how to calculate X. Okay, so I've decided essentially that what I'm going to do is focus on the modeling process. And the question I should be asking myself is, okay, when I say modeling, what exactly do I mean? So what I'm going to do is actually list exactly what I mean by modeling. So it might mean something like this. I will start by saying what it is I want to achieve. I will show the steps I'm going to follow so they can actually see a diagram of the steps. As I'm modeling, I will explain how each step helps me solve a problem. And at the end, I'll give them some kind of tip that's going to help them remember the steps so that the strategy is not owned by me, but it's actually passed on onto the students as well. Okay, and the last thing there, it says try it, monitor it, adjust. So once you know exactly what it is you're trying to do, then you can monitor it. You can see if it helps. If it is not working as expected, then we can make adjustments. It's absolutely fine to do that. So implementation is a massive topic. There is a guidance report on the EEF website looking at implementation, and there's also an online course looking at implementation, so you can find out more about that. Obviously, you could get in touch with Kingsbridge Research School if that's something you want to ask questions about, or spam Freya with your questions. But I'm only kind of scratching the surface of that today, but I think it is important to address it as well. So we're not just kind of passively watching the webinar, but have a kind of action plan at the end of it as well. So let me review some key points. We focused mainly on the EEF's home learning guidance, and that's part of their COVID-19 support pack. This draws on the full metacognition guidance report, and again, you can find out more there if you like. We asked why this matters. The answer is because now more than ever, our students need support with metacognitive strategy. The steps, what were the steps? They were activate, try to remember them myself, to link to prior knowledge, explain the strategy, practice the strategy, reflect on it, and review it. We've also looked at a few examples, and we ended by talking about implementation. So my advice around next steps would be reread the planning framework, download those exemplars from the EEF's website, have a look at those because you might find one that is specific to your subject, and then make a plan for which aspect of the framework you are going to address. Are you going to try and do the whole thing? Are you going to do this with just one class, just one lesson, just one part of the framework? So you want to give yourself the best chance of success there by being really specific about what it is you want to do. So that brings us to the end of the webinar. I hope you found it useful and relevant. I know there's a lot to think about there. So if you are a CPD lead and you're watching, and this is something you want to follow up in your own school, please, obviously, you can get in touch with Kingsbridge Research School or your nearest research school. And if you want a copy of the PowerPoint slides, get in touch and we can sort that out. We will keep the Q&A open for 10 minutes or so, so I've got a chance to go in there and have a look myself. Massive thanks to Freya for dealing with the questions. We are planning more webinars based on the EF's COVID guidance. So to help us get an idea of what is a priority for you, we've opened a poll, which again is near the Q&A box. So if you could just indicate one preference, that would really help guide us in what we decide to do next. Hopefully in the next one, Freya and I will swap places so you get a bit of variety and I can get away from the camera. We will let you know the date of that via email once we've got it confirmed. So thank you once again and have a great day. Thank you.